They say time smooths out the rough edges of memory, but I've come to learn that some things stay sharp, even after the years have had their way with you. My name's Margaret, though most people around the village call me Maggie. I live in a little cottage by the sea with peeling white paint and a kettle that never stops whistling. My husband, Thomas, passed away 10 years ago this spring, and until the morning that letter arrived, I thought I'd known him better than anyone ever could. It was a Thursday when it came. The postman, Alan, gave me a wave through the window, same as he always does. I shuffled to the door, took the small bundle of envelopes, and that's when I saw it. An old, yellowed envelope with faded edges and a postmark from Manchester. The date stopped me cold. 1983. I turned it over twice, thinking surely it was some mistake. The handwriting was unmistakable, though, looping and neat. Thomas's handwriting. My Thomas. I felt my chest tighten. For a moment, I thought perhaps it was some old bill or a letter he'd written and never sent, but it had my maiden name. Margaret Ellis. That meant he'd written it before we married. I made my tea first. That's what we British do, isn't it? A bit of hot tea before we face the unexpected. I sat by the window, the sea glinting in the distance, and held that envelope like it was something alive. The paper was brittle. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first words, "My dearest Maggie," took me back to being 20 again, to the sound of his laughter, to the walks along the pier and the drizzle, to that feeling that the whole world was ahead of us. But as I read, something inside me shifted. The letter wasn't what I expected. Thomas wrote about something he'd done, something he never told me. He said there had been another woman once, before we married. He said he'd broken it off, but not before she told him she was expecting. My breath caught. I felt as if the air had left the room. He said he'd tried to do right by everyone, that he'd written me this letter to tell me the truth before we built a life together, but he'd never sent it. He must have posted it, but perhaps it was lost. Or perhaps, I thought bitterly, he hoped it would never reach me. I don't remember how long I sat there. The kettle whistled again, the wind brushed against the glass, and my heart thudded like it had the day I first fell in love. 50 years. 50 years, and only now I was learning that my husband, the man who built my garden fence, who made my porridge every morning, who held me through every storm, had carried a secret that big. I folded the letter, gently like it might crumble if I breathed too hard. I looked around the room, the photographs of our wedding, of our children, of our holidays to Cornwall, all those years that felt so honest. All those nights I thought he was an open book. Later that evening, I walked down to the beach. It was quiet, just the sound of the gulls and the waves. I thought about what kind of woman she might have been, this other one. Did she ever tell the child? Did the child grow up wondering about a father who'd never come? I'll admit, for the first time in many years, I felt something like anger. Not the sharp kind, but a dull ache that sits heavy in your chest. Thomas had always been so gentle. He'd looked after me through every illness, through every winter storm, through my mother's passing. And now he was gone, and I was left with this one unanswered question. Who was he really? The next morning, I went into the attic. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped to find some proof that the letter wasn't true, that it had been some sort of misunderstanding. I opened an old trunk filled with photographs and letters from our youth. That's when I found another envelope, this one unopened, addressed to someone named Clara. No address, no date. The handwriting was the same. Inside, a single line, "I hope he grows up to forgive me." That was it. I sank onto the old wooden floorboards, the dust rising around me. Forgive me. For what? For leaving? For staying? For choosing me instead of them? That night, I couldn't sleep.
I kept hearing his voice in my head, calm as it always was. "It's all right, love. Everything's all right." But it wasn't, was it? The next day, I made the decision to visit Manchester. I packed a small suitcase, put on my old coat, and told my neighbor Helen to feed the cat while I was gone. It took 3 trains and half a day, but I arrived at the address written faintly on the back of the letter. A terraced house, ivy creeping up the bricks, a red door that looked freshly painted. I hesitated, then knocked. A young woman answered. No, not young, perhaps in her 40s. Her eyes, that was the first thing I noticed. They were Thomas's eyes. Blue, calm, kind. I asked if she knew someone named Clara. Her expression changed, just slightly. She said, "Clara was my mother. She passed away a few years ago." "Why?" I told her I might have known her, long ago. I didn't say much at first. She invited me in, made me tea just like any good Brit would. The house smelled of lavender and lemon polish. Family photos lined the walls. And there he was, Thomas, standing beside a woman I now knew must have been Clara. I felt my throat tighten. He looked younger, but it was unmistakable. The woman, whose name was Emily, noticed my gaze. "You knew him?" she asked softly. I nodded. "He was my husband." She went pale. For a long while, neither of us said anything. Finally, she said, "He used to visit us when I was little. He'd bring sweets, books, and he'd sit with Mom in the garden. But one day, he just stopped coming. Mom never explained why." I could hear the pain in her voice, and I realized she had questions too. Questions that had lingered her whole life. We talked for hours. Emily showed me letters her mother had kept, all unsigned, but written in the same looping hand I'd known for half a century. I told her what I'd found, about the letter lost in the post, about my life with him. We laughed at the same quirks, shared the same small memories that somehow overlapped. When I finally stood to leave, she hugged me. A long, trembling hug. "I think he wanted to do right by everyone," she whispered. I nodded. He just didn't know how. When I returned home, the sea was calm again. I placed both letters in the top drawer of my dresser, next to Thomas's wedding band. For a few days, I didn't know how to feel. Betrayed? Saddened? Relieved? In the end, I chose peace. Because love, I realized, isn't always perfect. It's not always honest, but it's real in the ways that matter. A week later, I visited the churchyard where Thomas is buried. It's a small place on the edge of the village, with moss-covered stones and a bench that faces the sea. I brought fresh daffodils, his favorite, and sat beside him. "You should have told me, love. I would have understood." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and wildflowers. I closed my eyes and imagined him there beside me, the way he used to hum under his breath when he worked in the garden. "I met her, you know. She's kind. You'd have been proud." As the tide came in, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Maybe the truth had come too late, but it had come. And in some strange way, I felt closer to him than I had in years. The secrets didn't undo the love. They just showed me that even good people have shadows. That forgiveness, sometimes, isn't about saying it's okay. It's about choosing to understand, to keep loving, even after the truth has changed everything. When I left the graveyard, the sun was setting over the sea, the sky streaked with gold. I turned once more to the headstone and smiled. "Rest easy, Thomas," I whispered. "We're all right now." And as I walked home, the world felt lighter. The letter that had once broken my heart had, in its own quiet way, healed it too. Because after all these years, I finally understood. Love doesn't end when the truth comes out. It just takes on a different shape. And sometimes that shape is forgiveness.
After that day in Manchester, I couldn't stop thinking about it all. About him, about her, about the years that had slipped through my fingers without me even knowing what I was holding. For days, I'd wake before dawn, make a cup of tea, and just sit by the window, watching the sea. The mornings in our village have a stillness to them, that quiet mist before the sun lifts, when the world hasn't quite decided to wake up yet. That's when my mind would drift back to those first years with Thomas, before the gray in his hair, before the weight of the world settled on his shoulders. I met him in 1965, outside a bookshop near King's Cross. I was working as a clerk in a fabric store, saving every penny to help my mom keep our house after Dad passed. Thomas was studying engineering, but he worked weekends delivering parcels to make ends meet. He was carrying too many boxes that day, and one of them split open right there on the pavement, papers flying everywhere. I stopped to help him gather them up, and when our hands brushed, he smiled. That smile, I swear I could still see it when I closed my eyes, even 50 years later. He asked if he could buy me a cup of tea to thank me, and we ended up in a tiny cafe near the station, the kind with steamed-up windows and tables that wobbled. We talked for hours about books, about London, about the kind of lives we wanted to build. He said he wanted something steady, something real. Not the sort of love that burns quick and fades, something that lasts. I remember laughing, stirring sugar into my tea, saying, "Then you'd better learn to make a good cuppa, because I'm not settling for cold tea and false promises." He grinned. "Deal."
We married 3 years later, in a small church near my mother's house. It wasn't grand, just family, a few close friends, and the smell of lilies in the air. I wore a dress my mom had sewn by hand, with lace she'd saved from her own wedding gown. After the vows, Thomas kissed my forehead and whispered, "We'll make a good life, you and I." And for the most part, we did. Our first home was a rented flat in Croydon. Tiny, with a leaky roof and neighbors who argued through the walls, but we were happy. We'd dance in the kitchen to the radio, him spinning me around while I tried not to drop the stew. We'd sit on the floor with takeaway fish and chips when we couldn't afford proper plates. There were hard years, of course, the kind of hard that comes with scraping pennies together and learning how to be two people trying to live as one. But we had each other. It's strange to think now that during those years, somewhere in the background of our laughter, another life might have been unfolding, one I never knew existed. Maybe he visited them then, in those early days when we were just starting out. Maybe that's why some evenings he'd come home quieter than usual, saying he'd had a long day at work. I never questioned him. Not once. That's the thing about trust. You build it like a wall, brick by brick, and you never think to check what's on the other side. When our first daughter, Lucy, was born, Thomas was over the moon. He painted the nursery himself, stayed up through the nights just to rock her back to sleep. He was a good father, the sort who mended toys with tape and told bedtime stories that made no sense but made her laugh until she hiccuped. Watching him with her, I used to think I'd been the luckiest woman alive. The years rolled on. We moved to the coast when he was offered a position at a local factory in Devon. We bought the little cottage I still live in now, the one with blue shutters and roses that climb up the garden wall. Life slowed down, and we found peace in simple things: morning walks by the beach, Sunday roast at the local pub, letters from Lucy when she moved to university. He'd always bring me a bunch of daffodils in spring, no matter how tight money was. He'd say, "They're cheaper than diamonds, but they shine just as bright." Looking back, there were moments that make sense now. Moments that used to puzzle me, but which I brushed aside as age, as forgetfulness, as nothing at all. I remember once, about 15 years ago, a young man came to the door. He was polite, maybe in his 30s. Asked for Thomas. They talked outside for a few minutes, and when he left, Thomas looked pale. I asked who it was, and he said, "No one important, just someone from work."
I didn't press. Now I can't help but wonder, was that him? The son? Emily's brother, perhaps? When I visited Thomas's grave again a week later, I brought that thought with me. I sat there under the willow tree, the wind tugging gently at my scarf, and said, "You didn't just hurt me, love. You left pieces of yourself scattered about, and now I'm finding them one by one." But even as I said it, there was no bitterness in my voice, just a weary kind of tenderness, because I understood. People make choices they can't undo. People live with the things they're too afraid to say out loud. I thought of Emily then, and how she'd hugged me, how her eyes had filled when she said she always wondered what kind of man her father was. He was a good man, I'd told her. Flawed, but good. And it was true. He wasn't a villain, he was human. He'd made mistakes, but he'd also spent 50 years making sure I never went without warmth, without love, without laughter. One evening, I took out an old photograph, one from the early days when we'd gone to Blackpool for our honeymoon. There we were, standing in front of the pier, hair blown wild by the wind. He had his arm around me, and I remember that moment, how we'd just spent the last of our money on fish and chips and laughed until our sides ached. Looking at that picture now, I realized that love, even when built on imperfect truths, can still be real. It can still be kind. After all, I thought, if that letter had reached me back in 1983, if I'd known everything then, would I have still said yes to marrying him? I don't know, but maybe. Because despite it all, he gave me a life filled with moments that mattered. And perhaps that's what love is at the end of it. Not perfection, not purity, but persistence, the willingness to stay. A few weeks later, I wrote a letter of my own. I wrote to Emily, told her she was always welcome to visit, told her she had a family here if she wanted it. I signed it, "With love, Margaret." As I sealed the envelope, I smiled to myself, a small, quiet smile, the kind Thomas used to give me when he thought I wasn't looking. I walked to the village post box, the red one near the old oak tree, and dropped it in. As it clanged shut, I felt something lift, a letting go, a peace. Maybe that letter was 40 years late too, but maybe, like his, it would find its way when it was meant to. That night, I sat by the fire, the clock ticking softly behind me, and I thought about how strange life can be, how the truth can hurt and yet somehow heal at the same time, how forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it just lets you live with it. It was late autumn when Emily came back. The leaves had begun to fall in the village, the kind that turn everything gold before carpeting the ground like old memories. The air had that crisp bite that always makes me put the kettle on a little more often. I wasn't expecting her. Truthfully, I didn't know if she would ever come. But that morning, as I was tending to the garden, snipping the last of the roses before the frost, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel. I turned, and there she was, Emily. She looked nervous, standing by the gate with her hands stuffed into her coat pockets. There was something in her eyes, a softness I hadn't seen before. I wiped my hands on my apron and said, "Well now, this is a lovely surprise." She smiled, that small, shy kind of smile that reminded me so much of Thomas it almost hurt. "I got your letter," she said quietly. "I didn't know if you meant it." I stepped forward, my heart thudding gently. "Of course I did. Come in, love. It's cold out here." We went inside. I made tea, of course, strong, with a splash of milk, just how I always make it. She looked around the kitchen as if trying to take in every detail, the old clock ticking, the faded curtains, the chipped mug Thomas always used. She sat down, running her fingers along the wooden table. I've seen pictures of this house, in his things. He kept them.
Did he? I whispered, feeling a lump form in my throat. He did. She nodded. He used to write letters to himself, I think, or maybe to you. I found them after he passed, never posted, just folded up neatly in a box. We sat in silence for a moment, the kettle gently clicking off behind us. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed slightly with time. She said, "I thought you should have this." I took it with trembling hands. On the front, in that familiar handwriting I hadn't seen in years, were the words, "For Margaret when the time is right." I didn't open it straight away. I just stared at it for a long time. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should. Emily looked down at her cup. "He never stopped loving you," she said softly. "Whatever else happened, I know that." When she left that afternoon, I sat by the window for hours before I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The letter was short, just a few lines, written in his neat, steady hand. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to say it myself. I never meant to hurt you. What I did, it was a mistake, born from fear, not from lack of love. You were my home, always, the one place I could rest my heart. If one day, by some mercy, the truth finds you, I hope it also brings peace. All my love, Thomas." I pressed the paper to my chest and let the tears come. Not the bitter kind, but the sort that come when you finally understand something too big for words. The photograph was of him, young, smiling, holding a little girl's hand. Emily couldn't have been more than 4 or 5. The sea behind them looked familiar. I realized, with a quiet shock, that it was our beach, the very same one where we used to walk on Sunday mornings. He'd brought her here, to our place. It should have hurt more than it did. But instead, I felt a strange kind of warmth, as though in his own imperfect way, he'd been trying to keep the two halves of his world close together. That weekend, Emily and I went to the churchyard together. It was drizzling, that soft English rain that clings to your coat but never quite soaks through. We stood by his grave in silence for a while. The headstone was simple, just his name, the dates, and the words, "Forever loved." Emily placed a small bunch of wildflowers at the base. "He used to pick these for Mum," she said quietly. I knelt beside her and added my own. "Daffodils, of course. And for me," I said, my voice trembling just a little. "Every spring." For a long moment, we stood there. 2 women connected by one man's choices, one man's love, one man's flaws. Then Emily slipped her hand into mine. I held it gently, and we both looked up toward the gray sky. "I think he'd be glad," I said softly. She nodded. "I think so too." We walked back to the village after that, stopping by the seaside cafe near the harbor. I ordered tea, she ordered coffee, and we sat watching the waves roll in. The world felt quieter, softer somehow. "I don't hate him anymore," Emily said after a while. "I used to. For years I did. But now I understand." I smiled faintly. Understanding is the beginning of forgiveness. The rest comes with time. She looked at me then, really looked, and said, "You're stronger than I thought." "Oh, love, strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's just about making another cup of tea and choosing to stay kind. When she left that evening, she hugged me, properly, this time. Not polite, not uncertain, but real. And as I stood by the window after she drove away, the streetlights flickering on, one by one, I felt something shift inside me. The ache that had sat heavy on my chest for months began to ease. Not gone, never gone, but lighter, like an old wound that finally begins to heal in the cold. That night, before I went to bed, I placed Thomas's letter on the mantelpiece, next to our wedding photo. I looked at his face, the same warm, hopeful expression that had caught me all those years ago outside the bookshop. "I forgive you," I whispered. The clock ticked on. The house was quiet, save for the sound of rain against the window. Somewhere outside, the sea kept moving, restless, endless, constant. And in that moment, I realized something simple but profound. Love doesn't end when people do. It just changes shape. Sometimes it becomes a memory. Sometimes a lesson. Sometimes it's a letter that arrives 40 years too late, but right on time for the heart.
We all carry letters in our hearts, words unsent, truths unspoken, love left unfinished. But life has its own way of delivering them when we're ready to listen. So if you ever find a letter that changes everything you thought you knew, don't be afraid. It might just be life reminding you that it's never too late to understand.